Alrighty. So my name is Mallory Kloucek, and I am with NAMI, South Dakota. And with me for this presentation is one of our young adult presenters. Her name is Caitlin, and she is from Brookings, South Dakota. And so we're here to just go through and just talk about mental health and mental health challenges, and to really highlight the importance of ending the silence around mental health, and to give you guys some tools of how to reach out and respond and what resources are available for you all. And so as we get going, there we go. I know a lot of us have done quite a bit of training on and off throughout the years on talking about mental health, things to look for, certain behaviors that some of our young people are experiencing. And so we're going to keep that in mind too, or I ask you all to kind of keep that in mind as we go through this presentation, because it really complements all the little lessons and all the little experiences we've all had leading up to this on really how in the moment we can interpret behaviors and how to respond, to really highlight the importance of it's okay to talk about mental health, and it's okay to respond to things that affect our mental health. So all right, let's get going. So these first few slides are probably going to be some refresher information, which is always good for us. We're going to talk about mental health in this presentation. And so when you look at the screen, as you can see, mental health affects all different aspects of who we are. Not only is it affect our physical health, but it affects how we develop, it affects the relationships that we have, and just our ability to absorb that information. You know, when our mental health is not well, it's hard for us to absorb that information. Sometimes it's impossible to absorb information. And so it's important that we look at that as we're reaching out to our young people, and as we're reaching and ourselves as well, as we absorb this own information of how well our mental health is doing. And so just to give us a little bit of background, it's important that we know some of the statistics behind what we're dealing with. As you can see, mental health challenges are very common. You know, 1 in 6 experience a mental health condition in a given year. And so, you know, if we have, or if we're in a classroom of, 30 students, that's 5 students that are experiencing a mental health challenge. And as you can see on the screen here, as well, is about half of those students aren't receiving any treatment. And so, and then the other half that do receive treatment, a lot of times there's a gap of 8 to 10 years before they actually do receive the proper diagnosis and the treatment that they need. And so as a result, a lot of our students are dropping out. A lot of our students are considering suicide. And, along the same lines too, 70% of our youth in the juvenile justice system have a mental health diagnosis. So a lot of these things kind of correlate. And so it's important that we, as the trusted adults in students' lives and young people's lives, is kind of keeping this in the back of our minds, that mental health challenges are very common amongst youth. And so just a little bit more background before we kind of dig into the nuts and bolts of this. We're going to say mental health conditions quite a bit in this presentation. And so when we say that, this is what we're highlighting. We're not going to concentrate too much on the diagnoses of mental health conditions, because our job as, just trusted adults is not so much diagnosing our young people, but just more of connecting and empathizing. And so, but again, to kind of have that education behind it when we say mental health conditions, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about bipolar, we're talking about depression, we're talking about eating disorders, we're talking about these conditions that are we hear a lot about them, especially more recently. So let's dive into what we're really going to focus on this presentation, which is our 4 steps to early intervention. So it involves knowing the warning signs. So again, that education piece of like knowing what we're talking about, knowing what we're seeing is a warning sign, and because it's so easy to kind of like rationalize things that we all experience at times. And then after we kind of dive into that education piece, we'll look at, well, how do we respond to this? How do we reach out and be helpful to these people? And then we'll look at, how do we work together? How do we work with families? How do we communicate with students and families? And then again, a bunch of resources and support that we have available for all community members. Okay, so warning signs. What do we mean by this? So in the there's a handout we provided for you guys for this session, and there is a list of warning signs on that handout, which you can refer to while we kind of talk about this specific slide. But when you look at warning signs, the thing that kind of stands out to me anyway is that we all experience these things, right? Because we all experience mental health. And so we all experience sadness. We all experience feeling withdrawal from, if we're just feeling insecure about something, or we're just feeling super anxious, sometimes we can withdraw from, activities. But the important thing to really look at when we see these kind of warning signs or these symptoms or behaviors from our young people is we look at the intensity of it, the duration of it, and the level of distress from it. So if I'm feeling sad, but I'm feeling sad as a result of breaking up with, having a serious relationship, and then we're broken up. It's okay to feel sad, right? And knowing that with a young person, knowing like, oh yeah, they were a couple and now they're not, I'm going to see some sadness from these individuals. That's a normal reaction, right? However, the intensity is it, where now you're hearing from the parents, or now you're hearing from friends that, that it's intensifying. And not only is it intensifying, but now you're noticing it's lasting for weeks and months. And now it's impairing how they're interacting with their peers. Maybe they're not doing their homework. It's starting to affect other areas of their life. And you're noticing this as just a trusted adult in this person's life. Maybe as a teacher, or just as a just someone that they are able to open up to, that you take these into consideration when looking at the whole of the person. And our guide is like, if it's lasting more than 2 weeks, if this person that you're kind of noticing some differences, and it's not getting any better, for one, and it's lasting weeks, more than 2 weeks, that's a warning sign. Doesn't mean that they have a mental health challenge. That's not our job to diagnose, but it's a warning sign. And so it needs to be taken into consideration as we go through the rest of this kind of intervention process, right? And so again, like some more of these kind of warning signs, and I'll use myself for example too. Like when I was in high school, what I was exhibiting at school was completely different than what I was exhibiting at home. And so that's what, when we go into the communication piece of it, super important, because, maybe at school, we're completely disorganized and, just really responding very emotional to like the up and downs of our grades, or maybe we're missing class, frequently. But at home, we're isolating, or we're having some trouble sleeping, but we are able to kind of um, be able to kind of maintain certain aspects of what people view us anyway. And so for me, it was at school, I had a lot of like perfectionism. I was showing a lot of perfectionism, and I was getting emotional over grades. But at home, I was isolating. I would make up stories to my family all the time, always lying. And so what two groups were seeing were completely different than the other group. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind too as we're communicating, because maybe, if we bring up to the parents, or we bring up to that person's caretaker, like, this is what we're seeing, and they're just like, that's not what we're seeing, that can happen, and just kind of ask more questions of like, well, what are you seeing at home, and we can dive into more of that dialogue. And so it's important to kind of keep these warning signs at the back of our minds, and to be able to, when we do start communicating, to ask those questions, and that's okay. And going into how do we do that. So for this kind of activity, I encourage you guys to just take a few minutes, whether it's right now or after this presentation, is to kind of do some, maybe like a writing prompt, and really look at these questions, and spend a few minutes writing your responses of what warning signs have you seen in the classroom, and what steps have you taken to address these warning signs. Was it successful? Was it something that you wanted to change or need to change? And I think the important piece too, as we kind of like think about this and reflect on these questions, is how am I viewing this? Am I viewing this from this kind of framework of like, what's wrong with you? Because that's what we're really trying to change here. It's not about kind of asking that question, especially to our young person, of like, what's wrong with you, but instead reframe it, and frame it more as what's happening. What has happened recently, and really kind of diving into that kind of just framework when we're looking at these warning signs. We're seeing these warning signs in some of the young people that were around, of like, okay, what's going on, what's happening, instead of like this punitive kind of approach of like, something's clearly wrong with you, because how we speak about this, how our language really is a contributing factor in why people don't want to disclose what's going on, and why we keep these things silent, because of that fear, and because of that just uncomfortableness that we all kind of have in the back of our minds. And that's what we need to squash. And so I encourage you guys, as you take this time, or after this presentation, take the time to kind of reflect on this, of if it wasn't successful, if the steps that you've been taking was not successful, is the change that needs to happen maybe just the language that we're using, and really trying to promote that different culture of how we view mental health. And so doesn't happen overnight. It's this is why we do these presentations as well, is to really kind of look at, okay, how am I reacting to this, and what can I do different, or what can I do better? And so the next little bit of slides, we're going to go into more of can be an overwhelming topic. So I just kind of want to offer this warning for individuals, before we dive in. But we are going to talk a bit about suicide. This can be just overwhelming for a lot of us, especially if you've experienced a recent suicide, whether it's in your school or just in your community, because it does affect all of us. And so to kind of gear up this conversation, we do want to just highlight some important statistics that are out there, because we need to remember that this happens in every community, and how we can better educate ourselves is to remind ourselves that this does happen, and we want to change that. And so, as you can see, this is the second leading cause of death for our young people. This is a nationwide statistic, but it is also correct in our state of South Dakota. This is the second leading cause of death for our young people. And the stats aren't completely out yet, but there has been an increase over this last year as well. And I don't exactly know how much of a percentage it has increased, but we know that there is an increase. And so it's important that we take this into consideration, because we need to talk about suicide. It's important that we talk about suicide. And so as we kind of unpack this a little bit more and help us as trusted adults to be able to respond to all of this, is, again, knowing the warning signs, knowing some of those risk factors. And so looking at the screen here, when we look at the risk factors, it's important also to remember that just because a person is exhibiting a risk factor does not mean that they're thinking about suicide or they plan to attempt suicide. It's a risk factor. So if you want to kind of use the example of, say, like someone at risk of having a heart attack, right? It means that maybe they have some high cholesterol, maybe they have some high blood pressure, perhaps they're overweight or obese. Those are risk factors, right? It doesn't mean that they're going to have a heart attack, but it is a risk factor to consider. And so when we say risk factors of suicide, having a traumatic life experience is a definite warning sign. Or, maybe they're being bullied by someone at school or in the community. Perhaps they had a previous attempt. So those are important risk factors when you're looking at the wholeness of the whole situation, because we also know that suicide is very complex and it doesn't just involve one thing. And so when we dive into the warning signs of suicide, going back to that example of a heart attack, if there's warning signs of a heart attack, it means shortness of breath, it means tightness in their chest, maybe it's some nausea, and you need to treat it as an emergency, right? If someone is experiencing these things, it means that there's a good chance that person's going to be having a heart attack, because these are the warning signs. And so it's kind of that same approach when you're looking at these warning signs of suicide, especially if they have the underlying risk factors as well. If, maybe they've lost interest, but you've also noticed all those other warning signs too of they've been, their warning signs have intensified. It's not gotten any better. It's, on top of maybe losing interest, now they're giving away their possessions. And you notice that they always talked about, this collection of vintage records or something like that they had, and they just, found out that they had just given it to another person. And, maybe you've noticed that they're writing or talking about death. And again, it's a consistent thing, and it's not this phase that they're going through. And so again, it's important to treat these things as such, of like, there needs to be an immediate conversation if you're noticing some real definite warning signs of a possible suicide. And so that's how we respond, how we go into having these conversations. There is research out there that the bringing up directly, are you thinking about suicide, actually reduces the chances of them attempting or completing suicide. And so it really goes against that myth that we hear all the time that, oh, if I bring up suicide, I'm going to implant in their mind suicide, and they're going to live it out. That's completely false. And actually, there's research now showing that says by us directly bringing it up, are you thinking about suicide? It actually lowers the risk. And so it's important to, because it is an uncomfortable conversation. It's extremely uncomfortable, but at the same time, we're responding to these things that we're seeing, and we're not just trying to rationalize in our minds like, oh no, they wouldn't do anything like that, and it gets us talking about it, because that's ultimately how we really end the silence around mental health conditions and around suicide. Is we need to talk about this. And so when we bring it up, if you notice like all these warning signs, and you're the person, you're just like, I gotta do it because I'm concerned and I care about this person, and you ask, are you thinking about suicide? And they respond, yes, I am considering suicide, or no, I haven't, I haven't thought about suicide. That's how, that directs us on how we need to respond further. And I don't know if any of you guys have taken any other trainings like mental health first aid or youth mental health first aid, but that's a great kind of training to also take too, in really using this as, again, we're not the doctors, right? We're the first responders to this. And so it's important that we do the follow-up stuff of just like, okay, are you thinking, if you're thinking about suicide, do you have a plan in place? And maybe they do and maybe they don't. And so that those kind of questions, those follow-up questions really help us to gauge like, okay, for one, we do not leave this person alone, and we follow up with, whether it's the school counselor, a social worker, the family, someone to help take this child to that next level of care, which is to a mental health professional. And so we still have this role in making sure that this person is getting to the care that they need, because they are seriously considering suicide, because of the conversations you've been having with them. Like, yes, this person, I am concerned, and I want them to, I want to do what I need to do to make sure that I am giving them to that next person that can handle this level of care. And I think it's also important to consider too of like how we talk about suicide. And we'll kind of dive into this too in some of the other slides. But if we're really talking derogatory about suicide, the chances of that person opening up to you starts going down. When we say, things like committed suicide, or, you know, that test was so hard, I thought I was going to kill myself. Those are very derogatory phrases in how we talk about suicide. And so it's important that we take that step back and really look at the language that we're using. Instead of saying committed suicide, we say, died by suicide. If they attempted suicide or had an unsuccessful suicide, use the phrase attempted suicide. It's important that we use these phrases, because it helps us look at suicide differently, that it's not this decision that someone makes. And there's a lot of, it's more complex than like, yep, I'm making the decision, it's happening. It's more complex than that. And so it's important that when we talk about it, that we give that attitude of just like, this is a complicated thing. And it's important that we have this dialogue around it. Because again, that helps move the conversation to again, how we can talk comfortably about these things that ultimately make us uncomfortable. And so again, reaching out and responding, it's important that we know the mental health contacts. You know, if we're in a school, we know who the school counselor is. We know who the social worker is. We know who, if there's like a partnership with a community mental health center, like we know who that contact is. And we want to make sure we're reaching out to the student. It's important that we have conversations with the student because that builds that relationship, that builds that trust. And then of course, always including the family as well. You know, making sure the family is involved in all these conversations, you know, are things that we can do in responding to what we're seeing in this child. If we're seeing those warning signs, if we know some of the risk factors that have been in their life, that we respond to that. And it's okay to do that. It's okay to do that. And so when we are reaching out, I know teachers are really good at this, and so keep being good at this is you know, using those examples. If you're noticing behaviors in the classroom, if you're noticing it, especially because you have that background of this, like, okay, this is a total warning sign there, and it's intensifying, and it's really affecting their everyday activities. Document those things, write those things down, give specific examples when you're sharing them with the mental health contact, when you're sharing them with the family. And also share your concerns. It's okay to voice, like, I have some real concerns about this child or this young person, and I want to share those concerns with you. And then, you know, ask, like, if the mental health contact prefers one-on-ones, maybe it's through email, and then, you know, setting up time to talk to them. And, you know, ask them, hey, I want to be able to talk to the student too. Maybe they have suggestions as well. But the important thing is that, especially nowadays, schools and, you know, certain organizations have policies in place. So even check on what your school or what your organization is doing to respond to, you know, someone with mental health condition or with warning signs or exhibiting any of these symptoms of some kind of response is needed, because that's a great guide as well as you dive into more of this response of these things that you're seeing. And so we also, again, want to reach out to the student, you know, building that relationship with that student and showing that empathy and having that compassion helps build that relationship, and really showing and using like those I words of, like, I've been noticing this, I am concerned, you know, I care about your well-being, and focusing on, again, using that language of just like, I'm not here to judge, I'm not here to punish, I'm here because I am concerned and I want to help any way that I can, and be an advocate for you. You know, it's when we're using that type of language, as opposed to like, I need you to not fall asleep in class, I need you to get your homework in on time, why aren't you doing this, what's wrong with you, you know, that shuts us down, right? That shuts anybody down, you know. And so when we can reframe it, and we can use more person first language, and we can use more concrete examples, and using those I statements of, and even before that, just modeling wellness ourselves, right? When we can highlight to the young people that we're surrounded with, like, you know what, I'm having a bad day today too, I didn't get enough sleep last night, you know, I feel tired, you know, I've had a lot of stress going on, and, you know, I want you guys to know that, because if I do need a few minutes to just do some breathing, that's what I'm doing, you know. That goes a long way when kids start seeing that the adults in their life also have bad mental health days, that helps them have ideas of how to cope and how to build those coping skills too. But especially in, directly tied to this, it's important that we use language that's not derogatory, and it's not stigmatizing, and it's comes from a genuine compassion and caring for that person. And so again, we want to reach out to the families as well. So it's reaching out to that mental health person, reaching out to that student, and it's reaching out to the families. And so along the same lines, is we're not blaming them, right? And so when we're using the language that we're using, that we're being mindful of how we're describing what you're concerned about, and not blaming that it's, there must be something wrong at home, so you need to fix it. That's the wrong approach to when responding to families. And listen to what they have to say, because again, maybe what they're seeing at home is completely different than what you're seeing when you're around them. And so having those active listening skills and being able to kind of get a better frame of like, okay, what is going on, and how can we work together, and how can we communicate effectively with each other for the good of that young person. And acknowledge the frustrations, acknowledge like, yeah, it's hard because they're being disruptive, and it disrupts the rest of the class, and then they go home and they're disruptive at home, and that's a frustrating thing to try to deal with when you have all this other stuff happening. Acknowledge those frustrations. That's okay. It's okay to feel those things. And then it's a matter of like, how do we respond appropriately to these things? And so getting into that step 3 approach of the intervention is again, working with families and students together. How can we, now that we're responding and we're getting this kicked off, how do we keep working together? How do we build this kind of partnership with all the groups to be able to keep this conversation going and keep the wellness of the young person at the core of it?
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, woo, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So that's a great video by Brene Brown in really describing empathy and how we can use empathy and build that connection with the people in our lives, and specifically for this, the young people in our lives, how we can make that connection through you know, recognizing something in ourselves that matches or relates to that experience that they're feeling, you know, the feelings that they're exhibiting from whatever experience. And it is hard. But when we do that, that's ultimately what helps us to be able to feel that, and then hopefully build those resiliency skills and be able to grow from that instead of just trying to like make it better, right? And so it's a great example in how we're moving forward with the rest of this partnership with the families, with the students, is when we can work all together and we can have these conversations and you know, build these coping skills together. You know, we can do so much in that respect. And so you know, it's asking those questions, it's figuring out what is going to work for everybody and how can we sustain this relationship for the good of this young person. And that looks differently for all groups, right? And so and it's just kind of being open to what all that stuff looks like. And it is hard, it's extremely difficult, but when we're able to do it, you know, that's when that child is really able to grow and be able to have that successful life regardless of a mental health condition or not. And so again, you know, partnering, it's about communication, it's about educating ourselves and the people around us. And you know, what form of communication works best? You know, is it you know, through email? Is it through texting? Is it just old-fashioned phone calls? You know, it's involving the groups of people that child is most comfortable with and has that relationship with. So maybe it is, you know, the lunch lady, you know, maybe it is you know, the school counselor, you know, maybe it is you know, that favorite teacher, or you know, maybe it is just this, you know, social worker that comes in every so often. Regardless, it's involve those people that are most closest to that young person and continue cultivating that. Make sure we're all communicating, you know, whether it's all the staff or you know, just the main mental health, the mental health contact, and you know, the family, and you know, a couple of other people, whoever is involved, that there is that regular communication between all those parties. And then always educating. You know, training's fantastic. And finding that training that has that fidelity to it, where there is some more follow-up of just like, here's some of the conversations I'm having, or some of the you know, the experiences that I'm having in the classroom. How can I continue this communication? How, you know, how can I best accommodate and bring this into my classroom? Educating of what's out there to kind of help guide you with that is huge, you know, whether it's improving your communication or just you know, finding those opportunities to build that culture in your classroom. All of that ultimately helps in the bigger picture of ending the silence around mental health and mental health conditions. And then, you know, building our resiliency. You know, students really absorb what adults are doing and, all can model it themselves, so if all the adults in this person's life is just really not owning and having their own coping skills with just everyday stress, it's really hard to expect the students to develop their own by themselves, and so us being the models of what are we doing to build our own resiliency, what are we doing for our own well-being, and how are we modeling that to the young people in our lives, and how can we continue to bring those resources, to the classroom or to a setting where the students can absorb that and be able to build their own resiliency and just continue to build on that for, future years. Showing interest, if you're noticing one of your young people is really good at art, show interest in that and give them that opportunity to be like, hey, instead of writing this week, how about you draw something that answers this question for us, give that positive feedback, offer that praise when you can, and give them that guidance, show them that, hey, we do need to set boundaries. It's okay if you need to, go to the bathroom in the middle of class. It's, let's set up a guide, so you're not just disrupting everybody all the time. Let's set up some kind of boundary. So I know that you need to go and, go to the bathroom or whatever it is without having to disrupt the whole class. What are those things that we can accommodate? What are those things that we can help build for their own boundaries as well as they grow up? And always encourage that participation, that's, when we can, give kids that opportunity to be able to participate with their own peers, whether it's, group projects or just, just having that time built in where they're able to communicate with their peers and kind of have that play time or whatever, is always important, because we always need that little brain break, even as adults. So kids need it as well. So we're not going to do this, but I encourage you guys after this session is to, there is an example in that handout that we'll give to you. And I encourage you guys to read that example and maybe answer these questions of like, how would you approach this specific scenario? Who would you involve and what outcomes would you want to achieve? All right, so let's dive into some resources here before I give it over to my friend Caitlin. There's all kinds of resources out there. It's where to find them and how to access them are the big questions. And so as organizations and schools, you definitely have access to a lot of resources. Talk to your administration, see what you can access as a teacher, as a a school counselor, as a just a person working with students. There's a lot of free resources out there as well. We do, you'll get a Padlet too that has some from us that has some resources on there that you can get access to. Some are free, some are paid, but that's a great resource to dive into as well. And then NAMI is a fantastic resource. You can always jump on the website nami.org, and there's just, especially if you want to dive into more of like the diagnoses, lots of information on that. And 211 is a fantastic resource in our state as well. They have like a whole library to access for you in how to find those resources that for something specific that you need. So it's important that we normalize conversations, and it's okay to ask for help. For NAMI, we do have a couple of presentations related to this. We have one for students, which is for middle school and high school students, where we talk about warning signs and how to talk to your friends about mental health. And then we have the same type of presentation for families as well. So it's a similar content that you heard in this one, but it's geared towards the families. And then, of course, we have NAMI Basics on Demand. We also have a NAMI Basics for Professionals, which is a great training opportunity for folks in that professional field that just want, to, again, do some refresher. It's a great complement to other trainings that that you've been a part of, you know, through ACEs and mental health first aid, and I mean all those trainings that our state provides. NAMI Basics for Professionals is a great complement to those. And also we have a NAMI Basics for Family too. So if you come across any family members that just want to learn more about how to support their school-age child, it's a great program as well for them. And it's all free. Nothing costs anything for families or professionals. And so thank you so much for listening to me. I am going to turn it over to my friend Caitlin, and she's going to share a little bit of her story with you guys.
All right, thank you, Mallory. So my name is Caitlin. I'm a nursing major from South Dakota State University. I'll be going into my last year in the coming fall. I'm originally from Casson, Minnesota, which is kind of by Rochester. And my family consists of my mom, dad, dog, and my 2 younger siblings who are both taller than me. I have a really big passion for music and for writing, which I try to cultivate every day if I can. And another big passion of mine is helping people, which is why I'm in nursing and why I'm doing this presentation today. So the beginning of my mental health symptoms started around 5th grade. I started to get really worried all the time, would always be convinced that the worst case scenario was going to happen in every situation. I felt panicky at random intervals, and these symptoms slowly got worse as time went by, getting its worst during my senior year. During my senior year of high school, I started developing intrusive thoughts along with these anxious symptoms. The thoughts would pop up with the anxiety, and they made me feel really uncomfortable and scared. They were images or phrases of terrible things like me hurting my loved ones, everybody in my life abandoning me, and even thoughts about if I would go to hell for being a bad person. They were so jarring and so terrifying that I would almost forget how to breathe when they popped up. And I had my most disturbing thought on the day of my high school graduation. It shook me to my core, and after that, the thoughts were constant. And I tried everything to make the thoughts go away. I would close my eyes and shake my head like an Etch-a-Sketch. I would pick the thoughts apart to try and figure out what they meant, if they meant anything. And at one point, I even started snapping my wrist with a ponytail every time a thought popped up. By noon that day, my whole arm was red. And I couldn't make them go away no matter what I tried. So I began to believe that I must enjoy the thoughts. So at that point, my mental health fell to the lowest it had been. I started to dread waking up every morning. I isolated myself from family and friends, and I was constantly asking my boyfriend for reassurance that I was a good person. He was the only person who knew what was going on, and I didn't tell anybody else because I was afraid of being involuntarily sent to a mental health facility if anyone knew what was going on. So I just pretended that everything was normal. In my heart, I knew that if they caused me pain, then I must not actually want the thoughts. But my brain couldn't understand that. I never felt more alone, and I didn't think that anything would be the same again. By the time August 2018 came around, I wasn't hiding my symptoms as well anymore, and my family urged me to get help. And right before I went off to college, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. When I heard the symptoms for OCD, everything made sense. Distressing unwanted thoughts, reassurance seeking, constant doubt. It was a complete relief to know that the thoughts and the anxiety was not my fault, and they were not caused by anything that I did. I always had a hunch that I had anxiety, but I never knew that I had OCD too because of the misconceptions that the illness carries. After getting a diagnosis, I decided to get a little extra help, and I sought out counseling on my college campus and built a support network with my friends, family, boyfriend, and counselor. After starting counseling, I realized just how severe my disorder was and started coming to terms with the fact that I would be dealing with it for a very long time. I was lucky enough to find a counselor who matched well with me on my very first try, and she allows me to advocate for my own recovery during our meetings. Some things that I found to be helpful for myself include scheduling out time in a busy day to do something fun to relax, accepting that I won't have all the answers to my anxious questions, incorporating my faith life into my recovery, and being more open about my disorders, whether it be to family and friends or to the general public. I also started diving into my passions more, including my writing. I wrote more poetry, journals, and I even had a book idea that I'm still working on today. I never would have had the idea for my book if not for my experiences. And writing really helps me by allowing me to put the pain that I've experienced into words to hopefully help somebody else. I also recently started medication, and that has been really helpful with suppressing the anxiety and helping myself get through the day when it's very anxious. So the definition of success for me has kind of changed as I progressed in counseling and recovery. My definition of success used to be that I would just get through one day without crying or successfully completing one task from counseling. And now my definition is being able to manage my symptoms in a healthy way and use my experiences to help others, whether that be through my writing, through my nursing clinicals, or through this presentation. I definitely consider this presentation to be a success because I didn't think I'd ever be able to talk about it in any capacity when I was at my worst. And I wish someone had told me that it is okay to talk about it. To wrap up, I've learned that my conditions do not define me, but they have shaped me. And I still have bad days, but they don't scare me anymore because I have the tools that I need to cope with them. I'm very proud of the progress that I've made, and I know that my mental illnesses did not break me. They only made me stronger. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for sharing your story with us. And just before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you maybe a couple of questions for the people listening. And so, because you mentioned that it started fairly young for you, around 5th grade, and it just kind of continued to intensify, and then really kind of that senior year of high school really just kind of came out more. If, and this is kind of hypothetical, but if you would have been able to make that connection or just kind of have some more understanding of just what was going on and just being more encouraged about talking about mental health, would you have been able to maybe gotten that help sooner rather than later, do you feel like?
Definitely. I think that because I didn't know a lot about it, I felt more alone. And if I had had the information and the resources, then I would have been able to get help sooner. And it would have been, I think, a lot better for me very soon, sooner than it was.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned just like some of the counseling and just like therapy, and I think there's a lot of just I know for myself too, just like this fear of like, oh, I don't know what to expect with this, and can you kind of just describe just for people that are just unaware of how counseling works and how therapy works, of your experience of how it was helpful in giving you tools and kind of ways to cope?
Yeah, it was kind of scary at first because I didn't know what to expect. But in my experience, I often just talked about the things that I was feeling or some coping mechanisms I had. And if they were harmful in any way, we would adjust them so that they were helpful, or would try to look at the feelings or possible triggers behind certain anxious moments. And I've heard it described as basically untangling everything in your mind and helping you figure out why you're feeling a certain way and how to help you feel better.
Excellent. Mine was unjumble. That's what we use. It's like it's untangled, like this unjumbling of the things that just enter our minds all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, awesome. Well, thank you again, Caitlin, for coming on and sharing a piece of your story with all of us. And thank you everybody for being a part of this session. And if you have any more questions, or if you're interested in any more presentations that we at NAMI South Dakota do, you are always welcome to reach out to us. through our website, namisouthDakota.org.